2819. I'm Sandra Dimez.
And I'm Brian Rohenbacher.
And we have an exciting show for you today. Are you excited, Brian?
Yes, I'm very excited. It's going to be a great episode, mostly because Sandra will be interviewing our good friend Jane Pantig from Christi, and she's going to be telling us how she addresses some pretty deep theological questions in her campus ministries.
And after that, Jeff will talk with biochemist Fazale Rana to get an update on the ENCODE project.
That's right. But first up is RTB 101. Krista will be interviewing Hugh Ross, asking the question, are viruses evil? Which is very timely right now in the season we're in.
Let's check it out.
Now it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about a very timely question is Dr. Hugh Ross. Welcome back, Hugh.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Now, Hugh, you had a recent blog post making the claim that viruses are actually good. Now, I have to say, after a few months in quarantine because of a virus, I have all kinds of questions. So maybe let's just start with the basics. What is a virus exactly? Is it a living thing? Is it like a cell? What is it?
Well, it's not a cell, and there's debate about whether it's alive or not. It's hard to tell. You're basically looking at a kind of a DNA protein combination that has the capacity to invade cells and reproduce itself.
Now, I know a lot of viruses can cause disease and destruction. So I think I've made a very long time assumption that viruses are the result of the fall. They're the result of and somehow connected to or initiated by Adam's sin. So maybe you can help me think about that issue.
Let me first put in a biblical context. The Bible says in many places that the laws of physics do not change. And so there's a constancy about nature. That's actually what allows us to be able to reliably do science and explore what God has to reveal in nature. But I think the thing a lot of people overlook is just the vital role that viruses play in making advanced life possible here on Earth. For example, viruses actually can float up in the atmosphere. They're really tiny, and they can form the seeds for the formation of raindrops and snow. And also they attack viruses, and when they attack bacteria, and when they attack bacteria, they break it up into little tiny bits and pieces. Those tiny bits and pieces also float up in the atmosphere. And so we critically depend upon viruses to get all the precipitation we need to be able to grow the food we need for our large population. They keep bacteria under control. They even play a role in climate stability, because viruses and attacking bacteria cause a rain of carbonaceous material to fall upon the oceans. They begin to sink into the oceans. This provides a food supply for deep ocean life and an additional food supply when those bacterial and viral particles land on the ocean floor. Then plate tectonics subducts that into the mantle of the Earth, and this is a powerful and essential means to pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So as our sun gets brighter and brighter, the greenhouse gases become less and less effective in trapping solar heat. That's one reason why our planet has been able to sustain life in a great abundance for such a long period of time.
Those are really helpful, specific examples, Hugh. It almost makes it sound like viruses are fairly abundant on our planet. So that's helpful. So then when we think about viruses that are damaging, help me think about how we arrived at that. Because if there's so many good viruses, and maybe they're not automatically the result of the fall, how do I think about situations like we've been living in with COVID?
Well, I can put it in the context that, herbivores, in order to maintain their population and their health, need carnivores. And God has designed the carnivores in such a way that they maximize the population and the health of the herbivores they feed on. Well, parasites also play a critical role in making sure we got the maximum abundance and diversity of life on planet Earth. 100 years ago, North America was plagued by the gypsy moth. and was bringing in their natural pathogen, namely a virus, that finally brought them under control and restored the ecosystem of the eastern forest. Now, because of human abuse, we wind up taking benign viruses and making them deadly. I mean, I wrote a blog making the point that when you look at every major viral pandemic that's happened over the past 2,000 years, we can attribute it to human mismanagement or human abuse. Just like we took mosquitoes that only occupied 10% of the planet, and now they occupy 99% of the planet. God never intended that. Likewise, we've taken relatively benign viruses and made them far more deadly than God ever intended.
So maybe in that sense, we could say God created viruses for good, but that
Yes.
humanity and our sinfulness has done things to alter the viruses that have resulted in a lot of the destruction and disease that we see.
Yes, that's something that scientists agree upon on this current pandemic. It was human mismanagement that actually led to it becoming a pandemic.
So how could we maybe turn the tables on this a little bit of how could viruses maybe actually be used to advance our faith, to advance the cause of the gospel?
Well, I think pointing out the benefits of viruses, how they've been optimally designed by our Creator, and moreover, just the future potential. I mean, we now have biochemists that are actually taking the viruses that exist on Earth and engineering them in such a way as to be therapeutic. So, for example, we may wind up coming up with a cure for cancer, at least many cancers, by actually being able to use viruses to bring in anti-cancer, therapy into the body. And so we got a future to look forward to. If we properly manage these viruses, it can lead to significant health benefits for humans and the animals that we depend upon. But again, just go back to the rainfall and the snowfall. That wouldn't be here without viruses. Long before we came here, the viral load on planet Earth was optimized for the benefit of all life.
Well, thanks, Hugh. That's a really fascinating discussion. Thanks for helping us think that through a little bit more carefully in a nuanced way. And I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't yet done so, go check out Hugh's blog. It's called Today's New Reason to Believe, and it's at reasons.org.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with Ratio Christi's Jane Pantig. Jane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, things look a lot different for you right now because you're no longer on campuses, but tell us about what you typically do.
So I typically go to campus. So obviously with what's going on, we're no longer allowed to be on campus. So we have conversations with students about any question that they have, and we have conversations and try to answer those and think logically and critically through them and hopefully giving them satisfying answers.
So when you say that you have these conversations, what does that look like? What is your setup when you're on campus?
Well, it depends on what schools are at, but two of the ones that we have really open conversations are at UCLA and Santa Monica, where we just set out blankets and have snacks and have signs that invite people into conversation. And, we just have a group of people going through the questions that they have for the day. And it's just a really great conversation that we have on a blanket in a circle and just eating snacks together.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to just invite people in. I'm guessing that in those conversations, of course, we're seeing a lot of this right now with the pandemic and with racial tensions, that you're probably getting questions about suffering and how we look at suffering in light of free will. So what sort of questions do your students have involving suffering and free will?
Well, obviously, we have this pandemic and a lot of people are suffering from that. So with that, people are thinking, well, if we don't survive these things and I suffer and I die, what happens when we die? So it naturally leads into death. So, but in the suffering, like people want to know, it's like, why are we suffering? What's the cause of our suffering? And what can we do in this pain and suffering? So people are always looking for something more positive as we're going through this.
Right. And so when we think from a Christian perspective, we look at suffering and we look at free will and we grapple with it. But I think for sure for non-theists, for those who aren't Christian, that for them, something that they might be wondering is how a good God would allow us to experience suffering. So how would you respond to that sort of challenge?
Yeah, so I like to take the approach of giving them some options. So we have three basic, options or responses to suffering. So we have pantheism, where it affirms there is a God, but like suffering and evil actually don't exist. So it's all an illusion. And then we have atheism, where it affirms there's evil, but there's no God. And so you don't actually have a grounding or a standard of what good and evil or suffering is. And then in Christianity, we have something that affirms both. So we know there's God and there's evil. So you line those up and explain that to people. People will probably think theism might be the best option out of those, because obviously pain and suffering is real. So with pantheism, it's telling you it doesn't exist. So it's like you could probably get rid of that one pretty quickly. And then with atheism, well, I can't even tell you that suffering actually, like there is actually suffering if there isn't a standard for it. So they're kind of ungrounded. So if you lay those out, I mean, Christianity probably gives us the best hope for why we could get through suffering and evil.
And I think that's a great way, just kind of laying out the different isms and unpacking them to say, like, where do we get even the idea of suffering? Where do we get that? And especially from an atheistic perspective. So I think that's a really helpful approach. And I would guess that the next step then in their questioning is to then think about free will. So how do you explain free will?
Yeah. So basically free will is the option to do A or B. It's like you have options to do something. You have more than one option is basically what free will is, in contrast to determinism, where you're just determined to do those things, which is more of an atheistic worldview. It's like what Dawkins would say is like you're dancing to your DNA. So there is no free will in atheism.
Oh, that's interesting. So I've never actually heard that there isn't free will in atheism. Do those atheists that you've spoken with, do they agree to that notion?
It depends on what atheists you're talking about. I think the ones that probably thought it through a little bit more would deny free will because they've thought about it. And it's just actually an illusion that you have free will, but you don't actually have free will.
And that's their perspective, that it's just an illusion.
Yeah. But the ones who are atheists and haven't really thought about it, they would like to think they do have free will. So it really just depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good reminder then when we are engaging in conversation, whether it's on campus or just somehow, whatever that looks like these days, that we kind of, it seems important in what you're doing is that we define those terms first. So what would you say then is kind of a key takeaway to really help people's approach as they're engaging some of these tough topics? What would you say is a key takeaway to help our viewers address some of these concerns?
I think asking the person good questions, because we can't assume, because, like if we logically follow what atheism has to say about free will, we could assume that there isn't any, but then the person you're talking to might say there is. So you actually have to deal with the person that you're talking to and then show them, well, actually your worldview entails this if you're actually following it. So like talking through what a worldview establishes, because some people have worldviews but aren't consistent with it, and to actually grapple and have have them be more consistent, because sometimes people pick and choose what they think their worldview entails. So like having those conversations and showing where contradictions can happen. But I think the most important thing is asking them good questions and working those things out with them, because you can never just assume that they're the textbook atheist or the textbook Buddhist, because that's just not my experience. Like, people will say, well, I adhere to this worldview, but then you're actually not fully adhering to it.
So really what you're saying then is that in your interactions, you're sometimes getting a menagerie of worldviews, even within the same person. So I think that your approach is definitely one that will help, knowing that we need to be able to ask good questions and ask for where people are in their particular iteration of their worldview. But I think that what you've demonstrated is that it's so important to know not only our own worldview, but the worldviews that we are likely going to encounter, so that we know and we're ready to respond. And to respond, of course, as I'm sure you do, graciously and with compassion and with a desire to really show that you want to learn more about the person you're engaging with. So I love the work that you're doing. And I want to just give you one more chance to kind of share what it is you do and how our viewers can find you.
Yeah, so I work with Ratio Christi, and I do apologetics and evangelism. You can find me on our website, www.ratiochristi.org, and just type in my name. And I'm also starting a YouTube channel where I'm just kind of going through questions that students have asked throughout the years and having crucial conversations of what's going on in our cultural moments right now. And my YouTube channel is Exchange, but it's a play on words with my name. So it's actually spelled EXJANEGE. So you just could go find me on YouTube. And yeah, I'll be there.
Thank you so much for that, Jane. And I just so value the work that you're doing with Ratio Christi. I pray that you'll just find some creative ways to continue engaging with students and with Gen Z. It's very important work. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome again to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific discoveries and how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today, I'm joined again by Dr. Fazale Rana, and we're going to talk about the latest results from the ENCODE project. Fuz, it's good to have you here again today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. How are you?
Doing well. So the ENCODE project, something that's been going on for roughly a decade. Why don't you tell us, just kind of give us a little bit of background. What does ENCODE stand for? What is it trying to do? What's kind of the science behind it?
Yeah, well, the way I like to think about the ENCODE project is that it is essentially kind of like the Rosetta Stone for the Human Genome Project, where the idea would be that in 2000, when the first draft was produced of the human genome, you have this massive amount of sequence data, 3.2 billion genetic letters in the human genome, but nobody knows how to read that. And so the ENCODE project was launched shortly afterwards as a pilot study to see if we could identify the functional elements in the human genome and understand what those elements meant to us with respect to biological function. And so in 2007 and then 2012, phase 1 and phase 2 results were published respectively. And to everybody's surprise, they basically showed us that a significant proportion of the human genome, pushing 80% plus, actually was functional, consisted of functional elements, which was shocking because everybody expected it to be well under 10%. And so the ENCODE project, since that point in time, has generated enormous amount of controversy for a number of reasons. But it's really a very exciting project because it's giving us some really fundamental understanding about the human genome and how the human genome operates.
So that's kind of an interesting description. So when you got the mapping of the human genome, which was done, you say, in the early 2000s, or at least the bulk of it, and then so ENCODE is kind of going in saying, okay, we know all this stuff is in there. Now we're asking the question, what does it do? What parts are functional? What parts are desolate, if you will? So it's kind of like having your atlas of the United States, and now going in and kind of looking at each of the different regions and saying, what does it look like, and how does this contribute to the country, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yes.
And so, your comment about the amount of functionality in the genome is interesting, because I remember, and I'm sure you will as well, there was this discussion for a long time about how many genes there were in the genome. And I remember these discussions of saying, there's got to be this many in order to count for all the diversity of humanity. And then it actually came out to be a relatively small number, which to me is indicative of a fairly complicated system, if you will. So to me, I guess it's not all that surprising that we find a lot of complexity or a lot of functionality. But how did that play out? What are the things that they found that says, this is function, and what does that mean from a creation evolution perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was I think 6 different tests that they were using for functionality, and collectively with respect to those 6 tests, it turns out that about 80% of the human genome displays some kind of biochemical activity. And many people would equate the biochemical activity to actual function. But one of the debates that was going on immediately was, could that activity actually be biochemical noise, or was it bona fide function? And that was a debate that raged and continues to rage actually today. But it turns out that there's a number of other independent studies done by people that are not connected with the ENCODE project that have demonstrated that many of those functional attributes identified by the ENCODE project are actually bona fide functions. So there's a number of independent studies that are affirming the results of the ENCODE project. So I feel more confident today that that result of the ENCODE project, first reported in 2012, is actually a valid result.
So the significant finding was that this 80%, and I think in other places you mentioned possibly it's going to be more than that, has some sort of chemical or biological activity, which then there's this connection with biological or function, which is important because you got this concept of junk DNA out there, where there's this stuff just littered through our genome that's junk and doesn't do anything. If I get you right, this biological activity, if that's function, that means the junk DNA has function as well, correct?
That's exactly right. I mean, many of the so-called functional regions in the human genome are actually what we would have attributed to junk DNA prior to the results of the ENCODE project. And it turns out that a lot of that so-called junk DNA is actually functioning in a regulatory role, turning on and turning off genes at the right time. And it's really that combination of turning on genes, turning them off, and then once a gene is turned on, regulating how active that gene is, that really allows for the biological diversity that we see in human beings. So even though you've got about 20,000 genes in the human genome, the way that you're using those genes is really what contributes to biological diversity. And it's all through the so-called junk DNA that's, again, functioning as this very elaborate system of on-off switches and then volume control knobs, in effect, that is really responsible for our biology.
So that's actually very fascinating. So this idea that there are a relatively small number of genes makes sense in light of this regulatory function that the quote-unquote junk DNA was playing. So you can have a small number of genes, they're just manipulated by the quote-unquote junk DNA in order of when to turn on. So it really kind of belies the idea that it's actually junk, it would seem.
Yes, and of course, people that hold to the evolutionary paradigm are uncomfortable with the results of the ENCODE project. And I've heard a number of evolutionary biologists say in a number of contexts that if the results of the ENCODE project are correct, then it means that fundamental ideas that are part of the evolutionary paradigm simply cannot be valid. And so they, on that basis, they actually raise fundamental questions about the validity of the ENCODE project results. And to me, that always feels a bit like a bizarro world approach to science, where suddenly you've got the theory being used to evaluate the data versus the data being used to evaluate the theory. But this is showing you how deeply committed people are to the evolutionary framework, and how troubling the ENCODE project results actually are for somebody that would view life's history in evolutionary terms.
If you could just kind of take the last 30 seconds here or so to what's going on? What are the latest things that come out of the ENCODE project? Kind of bring us up to date.
Yeah, well, there's the latest results really are centered around what do we mean by function, where I think there's a growing collection of data that indicates that the way the ENCODE project defined function is actually legitimate. There's a debate going on about what is the actual percentage of the human genome that could truly be functional. Again, the results that are coming out of that indicate that the original results of the ENCODE project seems to be valid. So, the ENCODE project is still generating data. They're in actually phase 4. But what to me is most significant is the fact that there are, again, people outside the ENCODE project that are doing work that continues to affirm the original results published from phase 2 in 2012. So it really is that the case for design in the genome is becoming stronger.
Well, again, I thank you very much for your comments, Fuzz. It was a very fascinating discussion today. I remember first hearing about the ENCODE project and just being fascinated of how this extensive advancement of science, advancement of our understanding of the human genome, how it not only undermines an evolutionary scenario, it actually points to a creation type scenario. I would encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out Fuzz's writings on this. One particular article you can look for is, do scientists accept the results of the ENCODE project? It will help you understand this fascinating discovery, great area of research, and help you to be better equipped to spread the gospel.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of 2819 and that it equipped you to share your faith with confidence and compassion.
And don't forget, subscribe to the show and also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show.
Also, if you'd like the audio version of our show, you can get it wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Reasons to Believe podcast.
We'll see you next week.